You pass him every week. You see the uniform jacket, the name tag that hardly anyone reads, the steady hands that lift boxes and straighten cans. He is part of the background, quiet, efficient, nearly invisible. Until one night, those hands changed everything. Carlos Menddees worked the midnight restock shift at a supermarket on a worn avenue where delivery trucks hummed and neon signs blinked like tired eyes. He kept the shelves full so the city could keep moving. He stacked cereal, rotated milk, hunted for mismatched price tags. He swept the little islands of quiet that appeared between the aisles when everyone else had gone home. He lived in a 6x8 room above a laundromat, a place where the pipes clanged like a reminder. His bed was a single mattress, his kitchen a hot plate, his savings a mason jar hidden beneath a pile of winter gloves. Each morning he counted the coins, rolled them in paper, and tucked them into an envelope labeled with a date and a tiny, careful plan. Restaurante, 2027. The plan had been the same for years. Open a little place with a few tables, a counter that smelled of cumin and frying onions, a sign with his name. He had made that plan over and over because hope stretches when wages don't. He had come to this country 15 years earlier, without much English and with more stubbornness than sense. There were stories his mother told him in low voices about a life that required getting up before dawn and never asking if the work was seen. He kept those stories folded into his pockets. When the freezer fogged up and his breath made the fluorescent light seem softer, he remembered what they taught him. Do the work well, be quiet about it, save what you can. On evenings like this, the store's hum was a lullaby, cash registers closing, a janitor's radio playing a soft salsa, the occasional clink of a cart. Customers who shopped late were often the same, nurses on their way home, a man from the construction site who bought coffee in a paper cup, an elderly woman with a thin coat who moved through the aisles like she belonged to another decade. Carlos noticed them because seeing small things was part of his job, reading labels, catching spills. You get used to looking and not being seen back. Mrs. Elena Morales had been coming in for months. She moved with a slow deliberation, folding her list in a careful way, nodding to the clerk who handed her the grocery bags. She kept a small purse and an enormous patience. Her son visited sometimes, hugged her at the register, then left with the kind of hurried goodbye that said life was full. Carlos had learned the rhythm of her steps when she shopped. He had also learned when she looked lost, when the corners of her eyes shifted and she held her wallet like a sacred thing. That night, the store had a late-night banking kiosk, one of those in-store services where people could make transfers at a counter staffed by contracted agents from a third-party company.
Most customers used it for routine things, paying bills, depositing checks, wiring a small sum to family. It was a different kind of interaction, more official, more private. People leaned in, shuffled papers, typed codes on tablets. The kiosk was tucked between the pharmacy and the frozen food aisle, a row of low chairs in front and a screen above that tracked appointments and waiting times. Carlos was stocking the canned goods nearby when he heard the raised voice, a smooth, urgent tone instructing someone to follow steps, to not hang up, to authorize. The voice was inside a small collision of sound, beep of scanners, a cart squeal, but it cut through like a blade. He turned and watched Elena at the kiosk, a tablet propped before her. A young man stood close, leaning in as if to help. He wore a hoodie and a nervous smile that didn't meet his eyes. The kiosk agent glanced back and forth between them, tapping a form on a clipboard. A phone was pressed to Elena's ear. Her lips moved, nodding slowly. The young man had a printed form, an authorization to transfer funds, the number written in a hurried hand, $100,000. Carlos paused. The number didn't belong on any grocery run. His fingers tightened on a box of tomatoes, as if the cardboard could anchor him. He had seen mistakes on receipts, wrong prices and mismatched barcodes. He had seen people flinch at totals that read like mistakes. But this felt different. Something in the young man's movement, the way he kept checking the phone, told Carlos the scene was not a routine mistake. It felt rehearsed. The kiosk screen showed a countdown for the transfer's authorization window, a rectangle with black numbers clicked down, 0532, 0531. The agent was reading from a script that used calm words and an authoritative tone. The young man whispered to Elena, telling her how to verify her identity and where to sign. Elena nodded because she trusted what people told her in that small bright box. She trusted the man who explained the forms. She trusted the woman in the kiosk who had the badge. Trust in that moment smelled like confusion and responsibility. Trust could be small and private and shatter with a single wrong signature. Carlos felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the fridge aisle. He remembered his mother back home, the way she had folded her hands and told him to always watch for people who asked for more than they gave. He also remembered his own plan, the jar, the menu written on lined paper, the dream of plates that would one day carry his name. One stupid signature and the jar could be meaningless, the menu a paper promise. Protocol at the store was clear. Employees were not to intervene in private financial transactions. The kiosks were run by contractors. Customers had a right to privacy. And employees, stock clerks, baggers, floor staff, were not authorized to interrupt. If it's not a spill or an emergency, the nightly briefing said, let it be.
That rule existed to protect both customers and staff, to prevent accusations and liability. But rules on paper often break like glass when you watch an elderly woman about to sign away her life savings. Carlos could have walked away. He had counted the cost of risks 1,000 times. Your job, your hours cut, the manager's frown, the late-night schedule unraveling. He thought of the envelope tucked in his sock drawer. He thought of his mother's small grocery lists. He thought of Elena's hands, the way they trembled when she tried to read small print. Standing still felt like a small betrayal. He stepped forward. He did not announce himself as a hero. He did not raise his voice for attention. He moved with the quiet decisiveness of someone who had stacked thousands of cans and learned to balance weight under pressure. He put the box of tomatoes down near the kiosk and cleared his throat, just loud enough to be noticed. "Excuse me," he said in English with a soft accent, looking toward Elena and the young man. "Ma'am, do you need help with that?" The young man turned, eyes narrowing. "We're fine," he said, too fast. "This is personal." Elena looked up at Carlos, confusion painting her face. Yes, I need to," she said, but she didn't finish. The phone at her ear crackled with someone telling her to agree. Carlos crouched slightly to be at her level. "If you want, I can go with you to the agent," he said. "I can help read if it helps." The agent's smile did not reach her eyes now. "Sir, customers prefer privacy," she said. "We can't have employees interfering." Carlos watched the agent's lips shape the word interfering like a thin line of policy. The young man moved to obstruct the view, leaning closer as if to shield the operation. The countdown on the screen blinked 0410. Carlos glanced at the printed authorization the young man had. The figure at the center was heavy, $100,000. He felt the number like a weight in his chest. It was not just a sum. For some people that number was a life savings, a home paid off, a retirement fund. For Elena, who spoke Spanish in easy nods and soft vowels, it might be everything she had tucked into cautious accounts over decades. "Please," Carlos said, lower this time. "Who are you talking to? Who's on the phone?" The young man fumbled. "I'm family. This is my aunt's account. We're moving funds to consolidate. She's in a hurry." Elena's voice now small. "They say it is for their business. I need help. I am old." She clutched the corner of the paper like a rosary. Carlos watched the way she held it. He saw the tremor. He saw the way she nearly missed the tiny box that needed a checkmark. He thought of his own hands, calloused, steady, how they could sign and count and fold a paper without flinching. He thought of the mason jar under the winter gloves. "Why does it need to be moved right now?" he asked. The question was simple.
The man hesitated, and for a heartbeat, the agent's scripted calm wavered. "It's a corporate timing issue," the agent said, the script back in place. "It needs authorization before midnight, otherwise there will be fees." The screen's countdown blinked 0322. The word "before midnight" was practical language, used to create pressure. Scammers used practical language, like agents enrolling trust in a sentence. Carlos could have called the manager. He could have stepped away and dialed 911. He could have waited for someone else to notice. But people like him, invisible to most, live with a particular impatience at that level of danger. The kind that says, if no one else is stopping it, you should. He had learned to move when he saw an injustice unfold in the middle of regular life. He reached forward and, before anyone could stop him, took the form from the young man's hand. His grip was firm and unexpected. The young man's face flushed. "Hey, sir, you can't," the agent said. Carlos slid the paper so Elena could see it. He pointed to the number and then to the line where the signature would go. "Do you understand what this is?" he asked her in Spanish. "Do you want this to go through?" Elena's eyes filled. She inhaled, looked at the phone, then at the man in the hoodie, then at Carlos. Her voice was a thin string. "They said they are from the bank," she said. "They said they will take care." "Do you have a bank number to call back? Do you have someone you usually call?" Carlos asked. He had seen how honest confusion could be enough to make someone sign away their life. She shook her head, small. "No." The young man moved, a heat rising in his throat like a warning. He grabbed for the paper. "Give it back," he hissed. "You don't need to do this." Carlos held his ground. There were people in every aisle now who had looked up, a handful of late-night customers drawn to the tight coil of the moment. A woman with a baby in a sling recorded with her phone, the light from the screen casting blue on her face.
The countdown ticked 0205. "Call your bank right now," Carlos said to Alina. "Don't give anyone information unless you called them first." It was the simplest, most practical advice, the kind that could break a lie. He fished into his pocket for his phone, hands steady. He dialed 0 for the store manager line. It went to voicemail. "Please," Elena whispered, and nodded slowly. She picked up her own phone with fingers that had learned to move around calluses. Her hands fumbled as she typed the bank's number, something she had never really needed before. She had always trusted, and that trust had been like oxygen. Now it was failing. The young man leaned in and tried to snatch the phone from her. He tugged her arm with more force than necessary. "No," said someone in the aisle. The woman with the baby put the phone down and stepped closer.
Carlos moved between them, a shield of blank expression and little things a stock clerk learns. A voice that won't escalate, a look that won't threaten, hands that don't let go. "Stop," he said, simple and clean. "You are scaring her." The young man swore, an ugly sound, and pushed. Elena made a small sound like a break. Someone called for security. The agent hit a panic button under the counter and talked into the headset, her voice clipped but professional. The countdown on the kiosk blinked 0110. Elena's phone connected to her bank. The line was answered by an automated voice and then by a real person who asked for account details. Elena stammered through them, and the bank representative confirmed that no transfer should be authorized without a signed form from a confirmed number on file. "We can't verify a transfer to a new account without primary authorization," the rep said, "the kind of rule that exists to prevent exactly this." The young man's face crumpled. He realized the clock was not his ally after all. He tried to pick up the slip again, but Carlos's hand was on it. The young man shoved him. Carlos felt his ribs jar, pain like a surprised animal, but he didn't let go. He had lifted pallets heavier than any shove. He held the paper until the police arrived. Police sirens were a sound that seemed distant where he grew up. Now they came fast, blue lights reflecting in the freezer glass. When they stepped into the store, measured and efficient, the young man melted into a script of excuses. The officers took statements. They photographed the authorization form, took Elena's ID, and asked her if she wanted to press charges. She was shaking but determined. She could not imagine what would have happened if she had signed. Carlos sat on a low stool by the kiosk, the lights buzzing, the cardboard box at his feet forgotten. He felt the bruise where the young man had shoved him. It would be sore tomorrow. He thought of the mason jar, of the small, patient plan. The bank had confirmed there was no need to move funds. The police called the young man an alleged fraud suspect and took him outside in handcuffs, while Elena watched from her chair, a small, bewildered figure with wet cheeks. People in the aisle clapped softly, the kind of noise that means relief. Elena reached for Carlos and took his hand, pressing it like a benediction. "Gracias," she said, voice small, "for everything." The little crowd's phones kept recording. Some filmed the officers, some filmed Carlos with Elena. The footage would not stay in the aisle. The footage would be a piece of paper in the sky. But the story was not merely a victorious snapshot. The company had rules. The kiosk's contractor had rules. The store's liability concerns were a paper trail long enough to choke on. When the manager arrived, shorthand and polite, clipped hair in a suit that folded into corporate lines, he did not clap. He looked like someone who had read protocol until it became a reflex. "Mr.
"Menddees," the manager said, voice even. "We appreciate that you care about customers' well-being. However, store policy strictly prohibits staff from intervening in financial transactions at contracted kiosks. We have security and procedures for incidents like this. By stepping in, you breached those policies." Carlos felt the wind leave his chest. The officer nodded to the manager. The police had done their job. They had arrested the alleged fraudster and written a report. The manager folded his hands and pulled out a sheet of paper with bullet points and phrases like liability and company protocol. Elena's son arrived at the store, breathless, his jacket wet from a sudden rain, and hugged his mother, thanking the police and Carlos both in a rapid, broken cadence. "I cannot thank you enough," he said, eyes bright. "You saved her. God bless you." Carlos wanted to shrink. He wanted to explain that he had not thought of his job when he grabbed the paper. He had only thought of Elena and the number on that form. He thought of the mason jar, and he thought of how something he worked for might have disappeared in a signature. He also thought about what the manager's words meant. Breach of policy could mean punishment. He had seen frowns like this before. He had heard of suspensions for smaller infractions. "Sir, I'm not here to cause trouble," Carlos said. I stopped something I thought was wrong." The manager looked at him with a practiced neutrality. "We will need to review the incident and paperwork. Until then, you are suspended pending an internal investigation." The phrase landed like a hand closing on a drawer.
It was polite, official, and final. "We will call you with details." The officer who had spoken with Elena and the bank representatives offered his own quieter judgment. "You did the right thing," he said to Carlos. "Not quite in public. You probably saved her a lot of money. We can't tell you what's going to happen with your job, but you acted in good faith." Good faith in that moment meant both relief and exposure. Carlos walked out through the automatic doors into the night with his jacket zipped against a wind that felt suddenly colder. The mason jar in his head was heavier than before, the bruise on his ribs a small promised memory. He had done the right thing, but the store's response was procedural and precise, not human. Back in the break room, cardboard boxes stacked to the ceiling smelled faintly of citrus. The manager's office door closed with a soft click. The staff who had not wanted to interfere resumed their tasks with a quiet gravity, as if they had moved through the same hush after a storm. Elena went home with her son, money still in her bank, clutching the small bag of groceries with a grip that said gratitude, and a weariness that said she had been nearly undone. Carlos sat on a metal chair at the end of his shift, looking at his rolled coins and the envelope labeled with the dream.
He thought of how invisible he had been for so many nights, lifting things into place for a city that would never notice. He imagined the story taking a simple shape. One man did what he had to do. An old woman kept her savings. He imagined his name filed away in HR logs as policy breach. He did not know, in that moment, that a stranger's phone would already be moving the footage from a social media app to someone else's feed, that a short clip of him stepping between a man and an elderly woman would be reframed with captions the night would add, "Hero Clerk saves woman," and reshared by thousands who loved a small human act. He did not know that one comment would lead to another, that a single like could multiply into donations, or that corporate review would be complicated by public opinion. He sat with a bruise and the sound of the rain and the taste of cold coffee. Before we go on, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, your city, and if this moment matters to you, give the story a like. When the morning came, the store's front windows showed the city pulling on its faces, commuters, a dog walker, a delivery bike that threaded the street. The manager had already sent an email up the chain. HR had their standard forms. The kiosk's corporate office had their own set of questions and a polite statement about cooperating with authorities. That was the machinery of institutions, quick on protocol, slow on the human factors that make any story worth telling. Carlos clocked back in later that week, not because he was called, but because habits are heavier than instructions. He needed the pay, the shifts that pushed toward the envelope in the sock drawer. He expected to be told news, either some bureaucratic form of approval or a gentle end to his work there. Instead, he found a notice taped to the break room bulletin board, an internal memo from regional management explaining that, pending an investigation, certain staff actions might be subject to review. The memo was polite and composed, the language was precise and safe. It did not say suspended outright, but the implication was clear. When someone asked him how he felt, he could not answer with the brightness of victory. He felt the lingering rawness of the shove, the bruise that would bloom into a dark circle this week. He felt the cautiousness of someone who had moved beyond themselves to protect another, and now watched as systems closed ranks. Outside, the city went on. The supermarket filled again with people who would not notice if the clerk's name was printed on a plaque. A woman came in, put her purse on the counter, and asked a hurried question about where the pantry staples were. A man in a suit asked for bottled water. A teenager on her way back from a night class grabbed a sandwich and left. Life returned to its rhythm. But inside Carlos, something had shifted.
He had been invisible in a way that gave him shield. Now he had a bruise and a story, and stories sometimes seek the light. The footage on a phone in the aisle had captured his voice, his hand on the paper, the moment he chose to put himself between a practiced scam and a life of savings. It would live somewhere outside of him now, subject to clicks and captions and the will of strangers. He did not yet know the shape that would take. A few days later, after work, he walked home with his jacket open against a gentle rain. He passed a pawn shop whose window showed instruments he could never afford, a small bodega with flyers for a bingo night stuck to the glass. He thought of his mother, who would ask him not to make trouble, and of the mason jar with the restaurant plan. He thought of Elena, who had left the store shaking but safe, and of her hands in his memory, delicate and steady.
He felt the bruise when his shirt scraped it. It was a small, honest ache. When he opened his door and stepped into the narrow room above the laundromat, the TV on the small stand had been left on. News, a scroll of local stories running across the bottom. He had not gone to check for his own name. He did not want to be the kind of person who watched for praise, but he was not immune to curiosity. He put his groceries away, counting the small acts of care, and sat on the edge of his bed. A neighbor's radio hummed a soft ballad through the ceiling. Outside, somewhere in the city, a phone buzzed with a new notification, an alert that a video had been uploaded, one that showed a man who'd stood in the way of a theft and had been told his actions might cost him his job. The video had a handful of views. That would change. He could feel it like static in the air, an approaching weather system of attention that could warm or chill a person. He folded the paper with the notes on his plan and placed it back into the envelope. The label Restaurante 2027 looked smaller and yet more real. He had acted because he could not bear the thought of someone losing what they had saved with their whole life. He had acted because invisibility had become unbearable when faced with a moral line. The next morning, a man from the store's corporate office arrived. He had a badge and a folder with company letterhead and a form to fill out. He asked Carlos a series of calm, direct questions. "Walk me through what you did," he said. "Did you call security? Did you follow procedure?" Carlos explained exactly how he had noticed the countdown, how he had asked the woman if she needed help, how the young man had been anxious and had grabbed the form. He explained how he had asked Elena to call her bank and how the police had arrived and taken the suspect. He explained the shove and the bruise. The corporate man made notes. He nodded as if hearing a parable. "Thank you," he said when Carlos finished. "We will need statements and a full report. HR will be in touch."
The phrase, "will be in touch," is like a long exhale that means everything and nothing. It is the sound institutions make when they have to process individual actions into policy decisions. Carlos left the office with a paper copy of his statement and walked to the corner where a woman sold tamales from a cart. He bought one and ate it standing, the steam warming his face, the filling small and satisfying. He felt both heavy and light, the strange mix of a person who had done something necessary and then watched systems fold around that necessity like paper around a fragile object. In the days that followed, people who had been in the aisle that night began to talk. The woman who had recorded the video posted it with a caption that read simply, "This man stopped a scam." The clip was 30 seconds long, enough to show the argument, the paper, Carlos's steady hand. No one intended it as an act of viral marketing. It was a human impulse to preserve a moment that mattered. The first wave of comments called Carlos brave. Others were more skeptical, asking what rules he'd broken. The store's official statement arrived on a quiet Friday. "We are reviewing an isolated incident," it said, "and are cooperating with authorities." It did not name him. It did not call him a hero. Carlos watched the small swell of attention from a distance. He felt an unfamiliar flush when neighbors tapped his shoulder in small celebrations. A woman from the laundry downstairs handed him a bag of cookies. A teenager from the building gave him a thumbs up in the stairwell. The mason jar seemed to weigh more and less at the same time. Then the message came. He was to attend a meeting with HR, the manager, and a representative from the kiosk's parent company. It would be a meeting to determine appropriate action. The wording was bureaucratic, but the result was not hard to guess. He had protected someone. He had also contravened policy. Institutions are not made to handle the messy middle, where human action and protocol collide. He prepared for the meeting the way he had prepared casseroles, methodically, with attention. He wrote down the sequence of events, clarifying details he didn't want misremembered. He wanted to be useful, to give the facts with humility. He wanted to hold to what had happened, clear and true, because memory can be turned into accusation if someone decides it will. When he entered the conference room, the air smelled of coffee and the way places smell when they are certain of their rules. The HR representative had a face that had been taught to be neutral. The kiosk manager sat erect, insisting on a posture that felt like company creases. The store manager folded his hands. Behind them, the framed prints of generic supermarket photos smiled down like witnesses. "Mr. Menddees," the HR woman said, "we appreciate your desire to help customers. However, company policy is very clear. For the safety of our customers and employees, no staff member should insert themselves into private financial transactions. we must consider potential liability. Carlos told the story again, and it felt like reading a passage aloud where the voice shakes. He told them about the countdown, the paper, the shove. He told them about Elena's phone call to the bank. He told them about the police and the alleged fraudster. He did not embellish. "We will investigate," the HR woman said, in the voice of a person who had said it before. "Pending that, we have to take appropriate measures." He left the room with a short notice, suspended without pay pending investigation. It read like a bandage, practical and cold. The notice did not mention the mason jar or the restaurant plan. It did not mention the way his ribs ached. It did not mention Elena's tight, grateful hands. Outside, the city kept its pulse. People shopped. A child knocked a cereal box to the floor and cried. Someone laughed. Life is a mix of these things, and story follows some and ignores others. But somewhere beyond the conference room, the video had already taken a quiet step beyond the store's doors. It moved through friends and family and then to a community page. It was shared with a headline that read, "Stock clerk stops scam and prevents $100,000 loss for elderly woman." The number was everywhere in the headline like an alarm bell. People clicked, people shared, people added comments. "He should be commended. This is why we need to look out for our elders. What is the store doing?" The first wave of attention was small, nothing like the ocean yet. But attention has the habit of piling up stones into something larger. Each like, each share, pushed the clip farther than the store's walls, and each push added a new frame to the footage. People's reactions, their gratitude, their anger at an institution that would suspend instead of praise. In comment sections, strangers invented narratives about rights and rules, and the invisible heroes who keep cities stitched together. Carlos read some of it in the newsfeed on his phone, feeling both seen and exposed. He understood that attention was a double-edged thing. It could force an institution to be human. It could also turn a private life into public theater. It could bring money, or it could bring violence. He did not yet know which edge would land on him. That night, as he sat with a small bowl of rice and chicken, his phone buzzed with messages. A cousin sent a text with 3 heart emojis. A neighbor wrote, "We heard, so proud." A stranger had tagged a local reporter who asked if they'd like to do a quick interview. The reporter's message was polite and quick, like sunlight through a slit. Carlos considered responding. He thought of enduring an HR process with the bruise and the mason jar, and a new possibility in his pocket. People cared about what he'd done. He lay awake, the glaze of the city just outside his window, and felt the weight of what might come. The suspension meant no paycheck. The mason jar felt like a gamble with the house's roof as collateral. He thought of the old woman's name, Elena, and of his mother's admonitions. He had done what he had to do, and now bureaucracy would have its say. But stories travel in unexpected ways. He closed his eyes with the residue of the clip spinning through the internet, and a small, fierce hope lodged in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, the city would choose to reward what the store chose to punish. He slept like a man who had changed a life and had nothing else to offer the world but the truth of his action. When morning came, the story would be slightly larger. The clip would have a few more views. Someone would tweet with outrage. Someone would call for him to be reinstated. Someone would begin a small fundraiser page. Because when people see a single act of courage against a small injustice, they often want to act. What Carlos did not know was how many hands would reach out to him, and how many questions those hands would carry. He did not know whether the store would stand by its policy or bend to public pressure. He did not yet see the other faces that would soon enter his life. The mayor who likes to be seen on TV, a reporter who wants a human voice for an audience, a neighbor who knows a civic leader. He did not know whether he would use whatever came his way to begin his restaurant or to help Elena with her regular errands, or whether the mason jar would be a seed or a consolation. He only knew that when the city looked away, he had looked. He knew the small authority of a man who had seen a line and stepped over it, and that in that crossing, something irretrievable had changed. The bruise throbbed, his belly grumbled. The envelope was safe. Outside his window, a delivery truck rolled past. Inside, his phone lit up again, a notification from the woman who had filmed the clip.
"People are sharing this," she wrote. "They say you did what they hoped they would in a moment like that. Some are asking how they can help." Carlos read the message and thought of the mason jar and the label. He thought of Elena's hand in his. He stood up and walked to the window, watching the city breathe its complicated breath. He did not feel like a hero. He felt like a man who had done what he should have. He felt oddly visible. The rest of the story was not his to write alone. It belonged to the clip and the feeds and the bodies of people who would decide what to do with it. He had acted in a narrow moment to prevent an old woman from losing $100,000, and the ripples were already heading outward, building toward a force he could not predict. He folded his hands and waited. He folded his hands and waited. The clip moved like water.
It left the narrow aisle and spilled across feeds, shared first by neighbors, then by concerned strangers, then by local community pages that stitched small acts into a kind of moral map. By midday the next day, the 30-second video had been watched thousands of times. People who never thought twice about the night shift began to write about it as if they'd been given new, simple instructions. See who keeps things running. Threads formed under the footage, people tagging one another with messages that read, "This is what real courage looks like," and "Who would stand up if it were your abuela?" A local reporter messaged Carlos through a friend of a friend. A neighborhood organizer posted a link to a crowdfunding page she'd started with a headline borrowed from the clip, "Help the clerk who stopped a $100,000 scam." The page set a modest structure, a $100,000 target that mirrored the sum Elena nearly lost. The text below the thermometer was careful. Donations would go to support Carlos during his suspension and toward his long-held plan of opening a small restaurant. Any surplus would seed community efforts to help elders avoid scams. The organizer left space for verification and pledged transparency, receipts, bank statements, updates. The page felt like a public ledger of gratitude. Donations arrived in waves. Friends and strangers sent amounts as small as $5 and as large as three-figure sums. People wrote notes, some in broken English, some in Spanish, some with the kind of raw punctuation that makes a sentence tremble. "He saved my mom 2 years ago," wrote one woman. "When will we ever stop ignoring people like him?" wrote another. A few entries were gifts from local businesses. A baker offered free rolls for the restaurant's opening. A painter volunteered to paint a mural. Inside the store, the manager's phone began to vibrate in a way that had nothing to do with policy memos. Corporate relations got more calls than anticipated. The kiosk contractor's legal team drafted a measured statement that said the company supports safe practices to protect customers while promising an internal review. HR filed the same documents they always filed in these moments: incident reports, witness statements, a chain of emails that looked like scaffolding around a human event. Public pressure, however, has a blunt, persuasive force. An online petition cropped up demanding the store reverse the suspension. It gathered signatures overnight. A neighborhood Facebook group that seldom got more than a couple dozen comments ballooned with threads where people wrote about the invisible hands in their own lives. The janitor who always smiled, the bus driver who greeted every morning, the grocery clerk who remembered oil brands and birthday candies. Someone videotaped a line of customers waiting at the store entrance holding placards, "We see you." Carlos watched much of this from a cautious distance. He had never wanted attention.
He had never imagined that a bruise on his ribs would start a small moral gale. Still, it was impossible not to feel the current. A reporter came to his block on a sunny afternoon, her camera case scuffed and her questions ready. She asked him about the mason jar, about the restaurant note inside the envelope he'd shown her in passing, about what it felt like to be invisible most nights. "It doesn't feel heroic," he said in a soft voice that trembled just enough to be honest. "It felt like seeing something wrong and not being able to do nothing." The interview hit a sweet spot in the narrative. People heard the sincerity in his phrasing, the way his accent folded around small words. Local radio played clips. The morning show asked a panel of callers if the store should reinstate him. A columnist wrote an op-ed about how policy can be blind to the human moment. 2 days after the suspension, a middle manager from the region called Carlos. The voice on the line was procedural, but had been sanded by enough public calls that it softened. "Carlos," the manager said, "there's been a lot of attention. HR will expedite the review. We want to be fair." The phrasing still contained the economy of bureaucracy, a slow-moving kindness stitched into corporate grammar. But by then, public sympathy had become not only moral pressure, but political pressure. The mayor's office fielded calls. A council member who had seen the clip on her feed stopped by the store unannounced one evening. She didn't come with a camera or a script. She came with a thermos of coffee and a small envelope that held a check from community donations. "People are furious at how you retreated," she told Carlos quietly. "They're asking us to step in." That same night,
the store's corporate office issued a short statement that walked the line between procedure and public relations. We are reviewing the incident and have reinstated Mr. Menddees pending conclusions of the investigation. We apologize for the stress caused and thank all customers for their concern. The language was cautious but consequential. The suspension nudged into reinstated pending investigation, a phrase that suggested the company had heard the public. People celebrated in small ways. The neighbor who had posted the GoFundMe updated the page to note that the fund would continue to accept donations not only for Carlos, but to build an elder safety fund in the community. The thermometer kept climbing. As of this morning, she wrote, we've raised more than was expected within the first 72 hours. She promised a full accounting and thanked donors for trusting the process. The exact totals in the press varied. Some outlets ran figures that were later adjusted. The central fact that mattered to everyone who had watched the clip was unchanged. Something that could have been catastrophic had been stopped, and people wanted to act. The store's apology included an invitation for Carlos to return to work immediately.
When he walked back through the automatic doors, the late-night shift felt different. Regular customers clapped. Not a lot, but enough to alter the soundscape. The manager nodded with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Procedures still mattered, but in the light of thousands of eyes, they had been softened. HR's file on the incident would remain open for weeks. There would be interviews and follow-ups and a corporate review of kiosk policies. But the immediate, human thing, the possibility that an employee would be punished for stepping in front of harm, had been checked by public will. Reinstated, Carlos did the job he'd always done. Pallets, cans, the careful calibration of light in the aisles. Yet his world had shifted. The mason jar resumed its place under winter gloves, somehow lighter and somehow more urgent. The GoFundMe continued to attract donations, and the organizer, mindful of the need for transparency, met with Carlos and a small steering group to decide the best use of funds. Options were methodically listed: replenish Carlos's lost wages from the suspension, provide immediate help for medical bills from the shove, seed a small business account for the restaurant, and set aside a portion for a community elder safety education series. They decided, together, that the first priority was practical and immediate: cover the gap left by suspended wages and medical needs. The remainder would be carefully distributed over time to reduce risk and avoid sudden exposure. The community wanted to give everything. Carlos wanted to be practical. The first donation made an immediate difference. It paid for the visit to a doctor to have his ribs checked properly, and for a couple of weeks of groceries that meant more than food. They meant dignity. It allowed him to sleep with the uneasy knowledge of money in his pocket rather than its absence. Small, quiet acts of relief kept the narrative humane. Then the offers began to arrive. Not just money, but practical help. A local culinary school offered to sponsor a week of training for him, and a supplier offered discounted equipment if he promised to hire from the neighborhood. A retired chef volunteered to mentor him on opening a tiny cafe. An empty storefront on a side street, once a laundromat, was offered at a reduced rent by an owner who had seen the video and wanted to help. The offers were not gifts of destiny. They were pieces of a puzzle that still needed a frame. Carlos thought about the mason jar and about the way his life could tilt. Elena, who had been circumspect in the weeks since the incident, became a visible presence in the story again. Her son visited the cafe of offers, bringing her by to meet the people who had rallied. She insisted on thanking everyone personally, handshake firm, voice steady, the same dignity she'd shown in the store. If it wasn't for him, I would have lost everything, she told a local camera crew. But she also emphasized the all-important truth. He is not a hero because he wanted fame. He did it because it's the right thing to do. Her words slowed the narrative's glamour. They rooted it in something quieter: reciprocity. Elena later signed a small card and donated a modest amount to the Elder Safety Fund, insisting that the vulnerability she felt should be translated into prevention for others. Media attention evolved into invitations to speak. Carlos appeared on a local morning show with a producer who wanted a humanizing segment rather than a headline. They set up in a small studio with warm lights. He talked about his job the way someone describes a craft: simple, detailed, unembellished. He described the mason jar like it was an old friend, its label creased at the edges. He described the instant he saw the countdown and the way his hands moved without his permission. The host asked if he had any regrets. "Only that I didn't know more sooner," he said. "Maybe if we'd had more information in the moment, if people were better taught about these scams, this wouldn't happen." He used that platform to shift attention toward prevention. He recounted the 3 things the bank rep had told Elena that night: always call a known number, never sign to transfer money to a new account on demand, and take your time. The host repeated them for viewers. The segment felt like an accidental public service announcement. In interviews thereafter, Carlos always folded gratitude into a list of practical tips, small things people could do to reduce risk. The company that had suspended him, mindful of PR and reluctant to be cast as uncaring, quietly established a new training protocol for its contracted kiosks.
Staff would receive updated scripts to better recognize coercive tactics, and the store promised clearer instructions for employees about how to report and intervene in suspected fraud without stepping into legal liability. The kiosk contractor agreed to partner with the store to create a hotline connecting customers directly to verified Pink representatives, reducing the need for in-person authorization under pressure. None of these changes erased the tension of the earlier days, but they did turn the incident into an impetus for structural reconsideration. A month after the clip went viral, the community organized a small ceremony. It was not a grand affair, just a tent set up on a side street, folding chairs, coffee urns, and a table with tamales from the neighbor who had once fed Carlos. The mayor spoke, not at length, but in a quiet tone that acknowledged the pattern of invisibility. "Our city runs on the hands of people like Carlos," she said. "We must see them, protect them, and learn from them." She presented him with a small plaque, inscribed with his name and the date, intended not as an exaltation, but as a public marker of gratitude.
Carlos accepted the plaque with a mix of embarrassment and pride. He thought of the people who had signed the petition, who had donated $5 and tears and the time to leave comments. He thought of Elena's hand pressing his. He held the plaque in both hands like something fragile, then put it aside to the people who had offered to help him open his restaurant. The practical work of opening a small eatery was neither quick nor glamorous. There were city permits and fire inspections and a business plan that read like a homework assignment for an adult with little spare time. There were nights spent sipping coffee under a desk lamp, drafting menus in a cramped room above the laundromat. There were trips to the supplier and a thrift store hunt for a second-hand grill. He studied licensing, health codes, and negotiated rent. The GoFundMe's remaining funds were used carefully and transparently. A portion cleaned up the brunt of immediate needs. Another portion was held in a business account for the cafe, and a small reserve was set aside to seed elder safety workshops at the local community center. Local volunteers painted the storefront mural with colors that felt like sunrise, saffron, teal, and a deep blue. The retired chef taught Carlos to refine a signature dish, a simple plate that would be the heart of the menu, something that married the flavors of his childhood with the comfort foods familiar to his neighbors. "Keep it like you would feed your family," the chef told him, handing him a well-worn pan. "That will bring people back." Opening day arrived on a spring morning that smelled of street polish and coffee. There was an odd, soft nervousness in Carlos's chest. The mason jar sat on a shelf behind the counter like a relic. Friends from the neighborhood brought baskets of flowers, and Elena came with her son carrying a small bouquet of roses. The line outside was modest but steady. People smiled as if they were attending a housewarming. A local food blogger wrote a small, earnest piece about the way the empanadas flaked, and the broth had a voice. The plaque the mayor had given him hung in the corner near the menu board, a quiet reminder of the path that had carried him there. He hired 2 people from the neighborhood, one a cashier who had been working 3 jobs, another a young man who needed the structure of a stable shift. He made a small rule for his shop. Anyone over 60 could get a discount on Tuesdays, and once a month the cafe would host a free community meal for elders and caregivers. The Elder Safety Fund paid for the first 3 months of the program, which included a short workshop with a volunteer from the bank who taught people how to spot phone scams and verify transactions properly. Those monthly dinners became more than charity. They became a ritual.
They were nights when people brought stories wrapped in coffee cups, memories of neighbors who had once been invisible, and of ways small acts made entire weeks tolerable. Elena sometimes sat at a corner table and watched people eat with the same dignified patience she had always carried. She and Carlos developed a gentle friendship, sharing recipes and the kind of silences that say more than 1,000 words. On a slow afternoon, she brought him a jar of her own homemade spice mix, pressed into his hands like proof that gratitude could be culinary. The cafe's success did not turn Carlos into someone else. It smoothed a few edges. He had a more reliable paycheck. The mason jar was no longer the only thing holding a dream aloft. But the work remained work. Early mornings, cleaning, the long breaths you take when a table is noisy, and everything needs to run in the same rhythm. The plaque hung on the wall as a reminder that the city had chosen to see him, but he still kept his sleeves rolled up and his hands in flour. He liked the weight of routine. It felt honest. The legal echoes of that night faded into an institutional epilogue. The alleged fraudster's case proceeded through local channels. Police records noted the incident as a reported fraud attempt, and at one point the investigator called to thank Carlos for preserving the evidence. The kiosk contractor revised its training. The store revised its employee manual to include clearer guidelines for how staff could safely report and assist in cases of suspected financial coercion. None of these adjustments solved the structural vulnerabilities that make elders targets, yet incrementally they lowered the odds.
People sometimes asked Carlos if fame had changed him. He would laugh and say, "I still count coins." He told the story honestly. The bruise on his ribs that faded into a pale stripe, the nights he slept lighter because the jar felt like a promise, not only to himself, but to the people who had rallied. He spoke at a few community gatherings, not as a sermonizer, but as a practical voice. "Look for the small signs," he would tell neighbors. "If you see someone confused with papers and a phone, ask one question. Offer one hand." The plaque and the sign on his shop did not erase the broader issue that had made that night possible. City officials continued to run elder protection workshops, banking groups promoted better verification tools, and community pages shared tips as if they were the new neighborhood currency. The momentum that began with a 30-second clip did not solve everything, but it altered routines and gave people a script, an action plan, to follow when they saw someone in doubt. A year after the night in the aisle, the city organized a small program for everyday heroes at the community center. Carlos was invited to speak about his experience. He stood in a room that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and applause.
He told the story again. But he began not with himself, but with the people who had rallied. The woman who filmed, the neighbor who started the fundraiser, Elena, who insisted on dignity. He credited the network rather than hero-worshipping himself. When he finished, people stood up not to elevate him, but to celebrate what ordinary people could do when they chose to be present. Elena still shopped at the same supermarket sometimes, though now she frequented Carlos's cafe on slow afternoons. She had a routine of ordering a small plate and a cup of tea. She often sat in the far window where the light was good and watched the street. Sometimes she would wave Carlos over and they would talk about recipes, about family, about how being cautious did not mean living in fear. Once, when the cafe had a quiet hour and the rain pressed against the glass, she reached across the table and placed both hands over his. "You are my light," she said softly. "You gave me back my life." Carlos did not take the phrase lightly. He understood that his action had been a small crossing, one man stepping over a line to prevent harm, and that the consequences had unfolded beyond him in ways he could not control. He also understood that visible acts invite responsibility. The cafe was a place where that responsibility could be practiced daily, by hiring carefully, by offering training sessions, by refusing to turn elders away when they needed help with their phones or their forms. The plaque that once seemed like an uncomfortable honor became a symbol of a different kind, proof that communities can correct course when institutions are slow. People now looked at the employees who stock shelves or sweep sidewalks with a different kind of attention. They said thank you, not out of ceremony, but because the habit of gratitude had been nudged awake. That shift did not absolve systemic issues, wage stagnation, the precarity of temporary contracts, but it insisted that seeing someone was the first step towards justice. On the cafe's first anniversary, a small crowd gathered on a sprightly Saturday morning. Elena brought a cake. The mayor returned, this time with a small proclamation recognizing community care and courage. Carlos gave a short speech that rippled into laughter when he admitted he had never wanted to be in the center of anything. He thanked the people who had taught him how to make a perfect stew, the neighbor who had filmed him, the elderly woman who had trusted him enough to sit and share stories. He thanked the community for turning a bruise into an opportunity. That night, after the crowd had thinned and the ovens cooled, Carlos sat at a table in the back by the open window. Outside, the city breathed and the street lamp hummed. He took out the mason jar, now a different container, a small bank account card propped beside it, a list of receipts tucked under a magnet on the fridge. He wrote a quick note on the back of an invoice. Save for community meals.
He folded it and tucked it in the jar as if the jar were a trust fund for public sentiment. He thought of the line he'd crossed that night. He thought of the random geometry of courage, a shove, a hold, a question. He thought of the woman who had nearly lost everything and how one small action had prevented a $100,000 loss because someone chose to step into the messy middle between policy and people. The numeral still struck him, heavy and precise, the sum that could have changed or erased a life. In the end, the story's most important piece was not the money raised or the plaque on a wall. It was the new habit in a neighborhood, that people stopped glancing away, that they asked a question, that a stranger's phone light no longer felt like a voyeuristic glare, but a potential witness who could change outcomes, that a clerk, a person who had been invisible to most, could become visible in a way that nourished others. On the quiet closing hour, Elena stood at the counter. "We have a small tradition now," she said, smiling. "Every month I bring something for the community meal." Carlos poured her a cup of tea, sugar just the way she liked it. They talked about recipes and daughters and the small economy of favors that had held the neighborhood together long before the internet amplified stories. Outside, the city held its ordinary noises: sirens far away, the hum of a late bus, a dog barking at wind. Inside, someone washed a plate, someone swept crumbs into a dustpan, and Carlos locked the cafe door gently, keys jangling like small coins. He put the plaque back on a shelf where the light fell soft. He cleaned his hands and felt the steady calluses. He thought with a plain kind of gratitude that life had given him more than he could spend and less than he might have asked for. It was enough. If this story moved you, share it to honor the invisible people in your life and subscribe for more stories about ordinary courage.